Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from µ-Ziq, Magic Pony Ride. Okay, I think I've talked about Mike Paradinas enough times in recent memory where I don't feel like I need to introduce this guy. Underrated IDM legend, head of the Planet Mu label, been a fan for a minute. And I also plan on finally doing a proper series on his other albums later this year, so that's something else to look forward to. Now, in terms of what Paradinas has been up to recently, well, he's been as busy as always. His previous album, Scourge, from last year may have marked his return to making a full album in 8 years, assuming you're not counting the boatload of archival material he released within that gap, but he has kept himself plenty busy since then as well. He had that almost ambient-adjacent collab with Mrs. Jinx, which I covered in Some Stuff I Missed volume. He had a bunch of EPs under the Tusken Raiders name, and even put together that Alias's debut album, Boundary Road, which went completely under my radar and I still haven't listened to yet. Let me know if you really liked that one. And he dropped a pretty fun EP called Goodbye, which saw some pretty decent traction, and the title track from which also made the cut on this latest album. The title doesn't mean anything special as far as I can tell. At best a reference to the closer of Royal Astronomy, but it's not like he meant to say he was going anywhere with that EP's release. But in a lot of ways, it does feel like this latest album has been somewhat treated as more of a real comeback for Paradinas by fans than any of that other stuff. This one feels like it carried a bit more weight. I mean, Scourge was a fun outing for sure. I rated it positively when I reviewed it and still enjoy all 10 tracks on it. Although, as I mentioned in my video on it, that album did feel less like him bringing his A-game and more like a low-stakes exercise for Paradinas to get himself back in the swing of this whole music-making thing after having been spending most of his time in the interim on his massively popular and prolific label, or just raising a family. He's married to fellow electronic artist Laura Rix Martin, aka µ-Ziq, and they have 2 kids. I think they have 2 kids. Magic Pony Ride does have a similar backstory to Scourge. He came up with the idea for it while on a family vacation, though perhaps a bit more interesting one than just being in Wales. One weekend getaway saw him riding on Icelandic horses through a snowy landscape, inspiring the title, which already sounds more imaginative. Although stylistically he's sticking to his usual drum and bass wheelhouse, perhaps with a bit more focus on breaks than his last several, and he was also partially inspired to make the album while working on remastering his Lunatic Harness album for a 25th anniversary reissue set to come out next month, which led to a bit of stylistic similarity with that project. The reception on this one has appeared to vary a bit. A few outlets have been kind of middling, but some fans have even gone as far to say that this beats out Lunatic Harness. And you know what, I think it very well could. I mean, I don't personally consider Lunatic Harness to be one of his better albums. It's just a very solid album that happened to break Paradinas out to a wider audience, and I think he's made several other albums that stuck out to me a lot more than that one. So saying I might prefer this isn't the earth-shattering statement coming from me as it might be for some other people. But that's a conversation for a different day. Though if we were just going by my initial first impression of Magic Pony Ride, I would say no, this album was really nothing to write home about. I might have even called it his weakest album yet. When I first heard it, I was honestly kinda disappointed since I found the experience to be a lot sameier than Scourge. Most of these tracks are going for more or less the same kind of sound, a very pretty mix of crashing old-school jungle breakbeats with nostalgic-sounding melodies, and as someone who considers his most widely varied album, Bluff Limbo, to also be his best, you might see why a project like this, which ran together so much more, might not have hit me as hard at first. Although, yeah, you've probably noticed that I have been prefacing all these sentences with things like "at first," and yes, this album was a major grower with repeat listens. Honestly, this did rectify my biggest problem with Scourge in its lack of a stronger overarching theme or sound to set itself apart from the rest of his catalog. This album definitely has its own feel to it that none of his other albums do, and it feels like a lot more of a cohesive work. And that was something I was happy to hear even on that somewhat underwhelmed first listen. And as I sat with it more, I started to feel like this was hitting a very similar note to a completely different album I covered in the most recent Some Stuff I Missed, Illuvia's Iridescence of Clouds. That was another album that focused on very pretty and expansive mixes of ambience with lots of crashing amen breaks and the like, trying to evoke the feeling of flying up in the sky. Also, it had 8 lengthy tracks that were all functionally identical. Magic Pony Ride doesn't have nearly the same command of expansive space as that one does, but it does carry a similar vibe while also delivering much stronger and more present lead melodies, and it also doesn't run together as much as that one. Despite the similarly dreamlike vibe it carries, it feels more human and grounded in reality as well. Now, when I'm going through individual tracks, I don't think I'll have an absolute ton to say. Pretty much every single track has the exact same musical ingredients going into it. Melancholy but uplifting synth pads, a few chopped up vocal samples covered in reverb, some MIDI harp sounds, and of course lots of fast-paced jungle breakbeats. But there's still just barely enough distinction between each track for me to never feel like I'm just hearing the exact same track copy-pasted. The opener, Magic Pony Ride Part 1, was pretty consistently my favorite track in the bunch, and a really fun, exciting, and attention-grabbing way to kick the album off. It has a bit more progression in sound than most of these other tracks, and even introduces a few acid synths later on. But pretty much the entire first half of this album is variations on that same theme, with each track feeling like a musical continuation of what came before. The poppier and catchier tinges of Uncle Daddy leading into the more intimate, plucked harps of Pixing, which share the same texture of breathy vocal snippets. Unless has some really deep bass rumbles for that old school drum and bass flavor. Turquoise Hyperfizz has even more harp melodies that play faster and have a bit of a video game soundtrack quality to them. The twinkly quality to that one kind of reminds me of his classic track Twangle Front a bit, but without going nearly as over the top with everything as that one did. Galope and Goodbye kind of sit in the same vein as Uncle Daddy with some poppier and catchier melodic leads. The former feels a bit deeper and lower pitched, apparently acting as a tribute to Paradinas' father who'd passed away a few years ago. And the latter has some cool piano patterns and bleepy textures peeking around its crashing breaks. Apparently the CD version swaps the positions of Uncle Daddy and Goodbye, and while I feel like I'd prefer the digital version sequencing, those two tracks do feel like they could serve the same musical purpose, and swapping them most likely wouldn't impact the flow of the project in any way. Now for the back end of the album, we do get a couple of ideas that stand out from the crowd a bit more. You get a track like Brown Chaos, which has a much darker and more mysterious bend to its melodies and chord progressions than any other cut here. You got Shulam's theme, which focuses on a halftime beat and has a more brooding feeling to its airy major keypads. You get Elka's song, which very presently samples the voice of Paradinas' daughter. Apparently she also contributed to a couple of other tracks as well, but her presence is a lot more obvious here. Like, it is just very obviously a little kid voice on this one. It's a really cute and wholesome little moment. And the last two tracks return to the formulas the first half of the album established. Part 2 of the title track wasn't quite as attention-grabbing to me as Part 1 was. In context, it just kind of feels like another track that sounds like everything else and didn't really stick out to me as a major highlight. But then we close out with Don't Tell Me It's Ending, another track that also doesn't really stick out much from the crowd in terms of its sound, but it's very straightforward to see major melodic progressions that border on the four chords of pop do lead to the cut feeling like it hits the right emotional note you'd want out of an ending to an album like this. I do really like the way that the entire album flows as well as it does, and has a satisfying emotional arc that it seems to go through. These aren't qualities that I typically expect a µ-Ziq album to have. Even my absolute favorite albums from him tend to feel pretty all over the place. So it's kind of nice to get an album that does manage to pull off being as straightforward as it is while not taking away from his usual strengths. I could complain about the lack of sonic variety here. It was an issue for me, especially on my early listens, but I don't feel like this is the kind of album that would have benefited from that. I think more variety might have even muddled the idea he was going for, and the more I listened to it, the more the sameness of it kinda ended up working to its benefit, so yeah. I'm not gonna tell you that I think Magic Pony Ride as a whole is the kind of thing that'll knock your socks off. It doesn't even feel like an album that's designed to do that in the first place. I myself really needed some time to let it sit with me for it to grow on me as a result. It was not the kind of thing that I was in love with immediately. But again, every subsequent listen I gave it was a little better than the last. No other album of his feels this chill and laid back, unless you count Secret Garden as a main album, though that personally has more the feeling of a side project to me, but never mind that. And at the same time, no other album of his really got me thinking about Mike Paradinas, the person, than this one did. It does seem to represent how he's in such a different headspace from where he was in the 90s. It's obviously recognizable as the same guy who made a project like Lunatic Harness, but compared to an album like that, it's a lot more obvious that he's settled down more, he obviously has a family, he's gone through some personal loss, and that all directly reflects in the tone of the music itself, which doesn't have nearly as much of the edginess that permeated through his earlier work. It's just aiming to be very light and wholesome, and I think he executed that quite well. And it's one of the most emotionally resonant projects he's come out with to date, like the fully realized culmination of the direction he went in with Skrillex and Secret Garden. And I just really like how innately heartwarming the whole thing is. Yeah, not much else to say. This is almost certainly my favorite project he's put out since Chewed Corners, and has been sticking with me a lot more than I expected to off my initial first impression. As such, I think at this point, it's just barely edged into my feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.